Our world is changing, from the pandemic to social unrest to wars, division, and climate change. It's time to envision a new way of living in and surviving the shift of ages. The Hopi call this the time of the Great Purification and talk about different worlds. Their petroglyphs and the other petroglyphs around the world tell the story of what happens during the shift, the geomagnetic pole shift. Learn what the indigenous peoples of the world, scientists, researchers, prophets, psychics, remote viewers, and more say about what our Earth may experience in most of our lifetimes. Learn what we can do to prepare for what might be coming in a matter of decades. Are you brave enough to envision a new Earth? Okay, welcome to Envisioning a New Earth. I am your host, Joan Serio, and happy Earth Day to all. And in honor of Earth Day, today's guest is an expert in sustainability and the CEO of the carbon-free group, Jae Mather. And it's my privilege and honor to have you on the show today, Jae. Welcome.
Thank you, Joan.
Before we get started, Jae, would you please tell us a little bit about your background and how you got started in sustainability?
Sure, absolutely. I grew up in Vancouver in Canada, and we're quite lucky and blessed to have an amazing natural environment. But throughout my youth, it was quite clear that, for instance, the mountains got clear cut quite often, and clear cut meaning taking everything the mountain. And when I was young, I always found that really strange because there was some of the big trees there. Obviously, you can understand why they cut them down, but I didn't understand why they cut everything. And it just felt wrong. As I got older, I was more interested in the science behind it all. And then I went to university and did the closest degree that existed back in the 90s to sustainability, and that was geography. This predates when we had even environmental science degrees. Back then, there were biologists or chemists or geographers that did very specific pieces of the pie. And I chose geography because it was broad. And interestingly, I chose the arts degree in geography because it gave me more electives. And I did 55% of my classes were science. So I chose the arts degree so I could do more science. Ironically, instead of doing 4 statistics courses, I'd do one, and then I do a chemistry course, a biology course. So I took a sort of slightly different route. And luckily, when I went to university, I wasn't doing it to get a job. I was doing it to learn. I was fortunate to have that perspective. And the funny thing is, when I graduated, what could I do with a degree in geography? Not much. Here in Canada, back in the 90s, there was very little work. The only thing you really would be able to do is environmental impact assessments that would be largely disregarded by the companies that hire you to do it. So it was like, okay, well, this isn't I want to make a difference. And I spent a lot of time traveling around the world. And I ended up moving to the UK because one of the first times I was in London when I was, I think, 19, I remember picking up a newspaper and there was a section in the job section called environment, and that blew me away. And then this section was big. There was many jobs, and they were everything from start jobs all the way up to executive jobs. And that for me quickly highlighted I needed to be in Europe because Canada was 20 years behind. And so I went over to the UK, and over a period of 20 years living in the EU, I lived in 4 countries. 14 of that was in the UK, but also Ireland and the Netherlands and Switzerland, all working in the environmental field. And I mean environmentalism broad. This is everything from impact assessment work to carbon auditing to climate change strategy to waste management to clean technology support programs, clean tech finance, macro strategies around global macro trends. And I ended up teaching quite a bit. I was invited by the University of Birmingham in the UK to teach on their MBA program, all about global macro trends and sustainability and procurement as the lever for change. because procurement is an area I accidentally ended up in when I wrote a policy for a local government that I was working for in the UK that won a bunch of European awards for sustainable cleaning products. And I ended up having this weird sideline of procurement and ended up doing a whole bunch of teaching for many, many years on how if your procurement system is working right, you can really buy the solutions you need. And if it's working normally, you end up accidentally buying things that end up often contravening what your goals are, or making it really difficult to adjust or shift. Because if you've got a 7-year supply agreement with somebody to do waste management, for instance, for you, and it was designed around old principles that were not circular, that are not about high recycling, it's very hard to shift that because these are legal agreements. They're complicated. And I was invited by Cambridge University to come and teach on their postgraduate in sustainable leadership, which is still probably one of the top postgrads in the world that focuses on integration of sustainability into business. And that was great fun. Moved back to Canada about 5.5 years ago, and back to Vancouver. And I was very surprised to find that Canada was still 20 years behind. The 20 years I was away, Canada moved ahead, but it was still 20 years behind Europe. And it was quite amazing to go, oh, wow, we're over here. We're starting to look at stuff that we were doing 15 years ago already in Europe. And so it's been an interesting process of navigating these different perspectives and finding a way to make the difference that matters. My company, Carbon Free Group, I founded with some other co-founders back 14 years ago. It's based in the UK, and it was an offshoot of the first clean technology support program in the UK for the European Union that I ran. I was working with a bunch of really cutting edge companies, and I said, why don't we work together? And we formed our own business together. So it's a consortium of individual businesses and people who are all highly skilled in their aspects of sustainability, be it engineering or construction or finance or policy or grant making or education. We've got a whole raft of skill sets within the group. And I'm still doing probably about 25% of my day-to-day work is in Europe. I live in Canada, but I still work a lot in Europe. And I think that's really good because it bridges things.
Yeah.
And right now in Canada, I'm working on clean technology support for a couple of startup businesses in the clean tech space, providing consultancy to a wide variety of businesses and helping some renewable natural gas and hydrogen projects potentially launch themselves here in the West Coast, in the Cascadia region of North America. So that's a sort of very quick potted history.
Yeah, wow. And you've had the journey from, loving trees all the way to, developing a whole niche for yourself pretty much and leading the way, so to speak now. So what is sustainability for those that don't know?
That's a very good question because it means something different to everybody you ask. Even people who are deeply informed about it. You have 100 experts in sustainability, you'll have 100 slightly different perspectives on what it means.
Interesting.
People who know nothing about it, they'll have their own version. But at its core, sustainability is the ability to maintain. It's the ability to keep doing what you're doing without the system that you're working within degrading to a place where it's not capable of doing that anymore. From a very basic point of view, like a business is only sustainable if it's making enough money to cover its costs. If it's not making enough money, then it's shifted into unsustainability. If it does that too long, a business will not exist. Same exact thing for any system. Now, sustainability has always been a bit of a problem word because for those deeply in the space, it's not enough. Maintaining is not enough because we actually have to start a circularity process, which is much more than maintaining. We have to start getting net positive so our impacts have a beneficial impact on the world, not just break even. And this is why it's funny, the world's suddenly starting to go towards net zero. People are suddenly now, big countries are committing 2050 net zero. The fact is, net zero ain't enough. If you've got cancer and you're wandering around saying, one day I'd like to be at a point where I basically have enough cancer and enough healthiness to equal each other out. You have to make up for this. We have to transition to regenerative. So the word I use for when I say sustainability now, I'm actually saying words like beyond net zero. I'm saying words like circularity and regenerative economy. It's all above and beyond. And right now, like in the United States, this is a very interesting example of the top 100 companies in the US. There are about just over 1,000 directors and senior executives across that 100 businesses. Last assessment that I read, it showed that 3 of those over 1,000 have any background in climate change. Yet 30% of those companies have committed to net zero. There's this gigantic chasm that exists between commitments and abilities.
Yeah.
And this isn't just in companies, it's in governments, it's in processes, it's in international systems. So that bridge, that gap, it's not done by people who add a little green lapel to their pin on their shirt. This is actually a deep set of skill sets that are needed to start understanding that business as usual is not part of net zero. This is business as unusual. This is new policies, new mechanisms, new ways of counting. And that's what's really interesting here. Having ran a sustainability team in an accounting firm in London for many years, it was quite clear that we need to reteach our accountants and our economists how to count, because currently they only know about 25% of the equation. They don't know about 3/4 of the externalities that sit outside of their organization's short, narrow perspective on what is profit and what is loss. And so because of that, the vast majority of the costs and impacts on the world for operating as a business are completely outside of their perspective, and they don't take them into account. And that's because modern accounting standards need to evolve quickly to start understanding that it doesn't just cost you $1 to buy something. It also costs society. It also costs the local economy. It also costs the environment, and it costs future generations. And there's a cost to equity, and there's cost to all of these other elements. So
long-term cost.
We have the ability now to measure this stuff. We have the ability now with very interesting systems that have been developed that are highly robust to quantify and commercialize a lot of this thinking into decision making. And that is really where this all sits.
So a lot of it is educational then, what you do for companies.
Yeah, it's educational, although after 25 years of educating, I'm not that interested in education anymore. I'm actually now interested in doing. I don't honestly care if people get it or not. I only care if things are done. It's really funny because it's really easy to ignite this stuff in young people. It's easy to ignite this stuff in university undergraduates and even graduate students. But it's the business world, it's the executive decision makers who are the ones who make 95% of the decisions. It is the politicians. And educating people who are at the top end of their career, be it public service or corporate, is really difficult, because the fact is, to be successful, they had to know how to play the game. And they were really good at it. That's why they're there. And if this new thing called sustainability wasn't part of their radar set, it wasn't a skill they needed to be successful, they don't deeply often feel like they really need to understand it. It's hard to change that. And so it's an interesting conundrum.
Right, a new paradigm. So is sustainability something that we can just opt in and it's an option, or is it something that we really need to incorporate then in everything we do today, given the state of the world we're in right now?
It's a bit of both. Government can set policies and regulatory frameworks that default things towards sustainability. And there are ways of creating circumstances where you don't have to get by it. Like, for instance, in an office building, you can replace all the light switches with passive infrared systems that measure whether there's a person in the room and have a little timer that turn lights on and off. You don't need to be flicking the switch anymore. You can remove the human element and you get the sustainable impact, which is a massive reduction in energy. So there are ways of doing that. But at the same time, if there's a change which says we need to do something differently than how we've always done it, something big like flying on an airplane to go on holiday, if we're going to change something big there, then there's 2 ways to go about it. You either have to make the plane sustainable, which is where there's a lot of effort going into, or you have to say to people, well, is there something else you could do instead? Now that's behavior change. Behavior change is a gigantic challenge. I always say, it's not down to technology, it's not down to finance, it's down to humans. That's the challenge.
And we can see that with the pandemic and, behavior change here and how it's really impacted everyone on the planet, really.
Absolutely. And the parallels in the pandemic are hilarious, because if you go back to the Spanish flu in the United States, for example, where individual cities and individual states took their own approach to handling the pandemic, and there was chaos and there was significant differences in death rates and everything else and economic impact between one city and the city next door, we're doing the same thing again. And that is amazing that we actually almost 100 years later are repeating the same cycle. That was clear. That's why the CDC was created in the US, was to deal with that issue so that it doesn't arise again. So, it's challenging. And whenever you challenge human freedom, you're going to run into a bunch of big cognitive dissonance, which is where people will say, I want X and I don't care what it costs. I don't know why I want it. It's just what I think I want. And that is challenging.
Yeah. So you're right. It really does boil down to human nature and human behavior. And so I guess you could say it really does. The crux of it is a change in consciousness, but unless all of that happens, what do we do? So how did you get the funding going for all of this? Because it seems like, money is at the core of everything. And how for a new business, let's say, or people that want to start sustainable communities, where do they go for the funding?
And that's an interesting one, because it varies based on geography. Some places are more advanced when it comes to recognizing and seeing that people are trying to do something differently. They're there to support them. Other places in the world, the mainstream financiers and banks don't understand it and don't care about it, or they view it risky because they don't get it. That's why most of the best examples of sustainable living today are down to micro groups that were self-resourced. And that, frankly put, is not going to make the difference. It doesn't matter how sustainable you are as a person, you always need a community around you. It doesn't matter how good you are at what you do. No one could be good at everything. And we all get old, we all wear out, we all become injured at times, we all have capacity change. So the only survival of any community is a group. So what is interesting here is that the bigger group, this is the human race right now, is hell-bent, Thelma and Louise style, running off a cliff. It's not complicated to see that there is no tenable economy or biome on the planet Earth with the current behavioral methods we're running to. We are never going to make it to 10 billion people if we continue on our approach, because the simple fact is the ecosystem around us is collapsing. And every single major indicator pretty well that has to do with sustainability is going the wrong way. So what is great about that is we have an opportunity to reinvent. What is great about crisis is opportunity and challenge. So I actually switched terminology now. I don't say problems, I say challenge, because a problem is negative. A challenge could be plus or negative.
Right.
I don't say disruptive technology, I say transformational technology or transformative, because it's about changing something in a way that isn't just about the negative side of status quo is going to get affected by this change. Yes, but they can also benefit by it. So that's why transformation is better than disruption. No one likes to be disrupted. You can't ask a human being, would you like something to show up and disrupt you?
Right.
No.
Right. We've had everything disrupted lately, so no, we don't want to ask that now.
Yeah. But that's what's the key point right now, is there's so many major environmental, economic, political, societal challenges occurring at the moment, that this is giving the human race an opportunity to actually alter ourselves in some ways that are better for us. We also might go the other way. It's going to be interesting to see.
Yeah.
Somebody asked me once to describe what it is I do. And I said, I work really, really, really hard to try and save humanity from itself, and I fail miserably. And I do this with millions of other people. That's what sustainability experts try to do.
I understand that. Yeah.
Help us with our innateness.
Really? So it seems that we're a species that doesn't, like you said, Dave, we don't like to change. We don't like to be told what to do, but we don't seem to do the change until we're at that precipice, until we're forced, until we're at that 11th hour. Are we then at the 11th hour?
We're at the 11th hour and 59 minutes.
I agree with you.
We are so close to system failure. We got less than 15 years as a species to change direction or to have World War III fought with clubs and stones. That is exactly what's happening. And the reality is maybe that's exactly what has to happen, because that's the cycles of nature.
Right.
Maybe
there's larger cycles. Yes.
Exactly. And the reality is that governments around the world are incapable in democratic environments of changing the situation towards a sustainable, non-climate disrupted way, because the population would be forced to change itself. And if the population doesn't want to change, it'll vote them out. So democracy is incompatible, it appears, with survival currently, based on how humans behave, because we are the first generation in human history that are actively destroying our children and our grandchildren's future knowingly. The first one in history. Yet the deep-seated resistance to change is probably stronger now than it's been in hundreds of years. And that gives us a feedback loop, which says, okay, maybe humans, because we're hardwired to deal with threats that are immediate, and we're not very well hardwired to deal with threats that are on the horizon. Like, you want to deal with something jumping out of the bush in front of you trying to kill you. You don't want to be dealing with something around the next mountain. So humans have got this default wiring, which says A is vastly more important than B. Even if our intellect says, well, hey, wait a minute, B is scary, I got to do something big about that. The reality is our innate nature as a species is also towards survival. You know, the reptilian survival brain compared to the mammalian brain in the human is really interesting. The survival brain is all about quick reactivity. It's about decision-making on the moment. It is about intelligent assessment of the situation as it stands. This is about controlling the situation as much as I possibly can. This is about trying not to be a victim to what's going on. The bigger mammalian brain, the longer seated one, is about creativity, exploration. It's about empathy and these other elements. And what's interesting is when you look at the scientific research and the psychological research on how humans behave, 3 out of every 4 reactions in a human being have to be positive to a situation for it to tilt into the full positive response, because we're far hardwired to remember a plant that was green and yellow that could kill us than we are to remember the colors of the butterfly flying by. So we have to have 3 butterflies for every plant that's going to kill us to shift our brains into being more positive than negative. Not equal. It's not 50-50. It's 3/4 to 1/4. And so with that given nature, that humans are hardwired to react to things and we're deeply in survival mode. The fact is most humans are running around in fight or flight responses to daily activities. How do we have the sage-like approaches to think longer, bigger about the future when most of our focus is on that threat that's right in front of us, which could be a job, a bank balance, it could be an ideology, it could be a coronavirus, it could be your partner, anything. It could be I just got rejected by X. That makes me really upset and triggers the fight or flight response. So this is a psychological challenge. This is not an environmental challenge. This is not a technical challenge. This is not a financial challenge. This is a human psychology challenge.
Interesting perspective. Yes. And I agree. I mean, if we don't change human behavior and thought, then we just keep repeating the same patterns. And I mean, I think that we are at a precipice right now. And Other guests that I've had on the show and other research that I've done said that, there's a larger cycle that may be running all of this. As you said, it's all cycles, and we're almost at the end of that cycle, like it or not. And there could be an earth cataclysm. And then, it's like the major reset button. And one of the reasons I started the show and the shows is because I think people need to hear the information, if at all they can wake up to it. And two, can we find a way? Is there any light at the end of the tunnel? And for those that are still here, because we've survived these earth cataclysms before, who is going to, what are the seeds that we're going to plant for the next earth, for the new earth? And I'm just asking the questions and getting people to come on, and thought provokers and people that see the truth of what is, like yourself, to give us a new perspective and educate us. And is there a way? Can there be a way?
There definitely is. Working in the clean technology space, we already as a human race possess the technologies to avert climate disaster. They're already here. We actually also possess the management systems to change our governance and our regulations and even our economy so that it averts the disaster that's coming. There are thousands of types of capitalism. There's not one. We just happen to be focused on one version of capitalism, which is neoliberal capitalism, which takes 3/4 of the variables and throws them out the door and says they don't matter. Those variables are the survival of the system that keeps the business alive. That's a pretty big variable to throw out the door. And that's what neoliberal capitalism does. But there are many versions of capitalism that do take those things into account. They incorporate them deeply into decision-making, into executive board decision-making and governance, so that you actually have a very easy way of having additional filters to say, how does this decision affect this? Oh, and also all these other things. And what's really interesting on a finance perspective, and I'm talking finance because the reality is this is what makes the world go round. Mm-hmm. Government and politics do not make the world go round. Finance controls government and society. That's how it works. So if we're talking about the king in the room or the queen in the room, that is money. Now, what is really interesting over the last 10 years is we've shown that environmentally conscious businesses, any businesses that are focused in on impact investment that makes a beneficial impact on the world or environmental impact on the world, they do financially way better than conventional businesses. Right now, your pension money in an environmental impact fund is going to make you more money than a conventional one. It's already that clear. So what's funny about that is that's great, because it's starting to show people that you actually don't have to make money off of destruction. You can make money off of regeneration. Already more money. Mm-hmm. In many places in the world, you could put a solar panel on your roof and get a much higher return than you ever could from sticking that money in an investment. Well, that gives you an opportunity to make money off your roof. And that's what's interesting here is there's so many technologies and systems of management around the world, and the donut economy model, the net zero model, the beyond net zero model, the B Corp models. There's so many examples of this. We got what we need already. Yes, technology is still coming that's going to make it even better. It's going to have a higher impact. It's going to have a lower cost. But we've already got it. The simple reality is the coronavirus has just shown the world how much money we can invent out of nowhere to deal with that challenge. Yeah. The reality is the amount of money we've spent on dealing with COVID across the planet is less than the amount of money it would take us to become a net zero economy. So guess what? We can do it because we're doing it. Mm-hmm, and also remember, money's fake anyway. It's made up.
It's all digital. So, it's all, it's just a shell game.
Well, governments print money from their central banks, and banks are given permission by governments to print money and make it up. When you get a mortgage, the bank doesn't have that $500,000 in the bank for you. No, they have a percentage of it and the rest is made up. And then you pay back interest on that made up money. That's how the economy works. So what's really funny about this is we can use those systems that are well established and deeply entrenched and we're not going to switch gears out of capitalism, but we can adjust it so that it works for us. It works for the world. It works for the future. very easily. And and when I say very easily, there's a caveat there. I'm saying the techniques are easy, the knowledge is easy, the human piece is not. And this also would mean wrestling the power away from the established groups that control those things, which is where the biggest challenge will come from. Right now, the top 1% of society are responsible for 5 to 10 times as many emissions as the rest of society. If you're talking about the 0.1%, they're talking about hundreds of thousands of times as many emissions. There's a huge disproportion. Wow. The richer you are, the more impact you have on the world. And what's interesting there is that means that there's a focal point for fixing some of that. And ironically, the richest in the world have the money to fix it too. So there are ways of shifting this process. And also there's countries in the world that are trialing some of this stuff. Minimum basic incomes to keep people away from poverty. Countries who are actually shifting things to say you're now going to have to do a personal tax claim every year, but you also have a carbon balance every year. That's what's coming. There are multitudes of countries that are starting to implement laws and rights to nature, like we give to people who are disabled or mentally ill, because we act as their guardians. Bolivia was the first country in the world to say, actually, nature has the same legal rights as an entity as, for instance, a person with Down syndrome. Therefore, you can't just abuse it. And people who were affected by your abuse can sue you. No, it has inherent rights. There is a new regulation that's being created called ecocide, a new human rights initiative at the UN, which means that humans, if this were to pass, would have the innate right to having a healthy ecosystem. Like, there are some interesting shifts that are going on. And because of that, we have what we need. We just need to get it better and better and better. And that's the future of the economy is about carbon, but it's about, ironically, taking carbon out of the atmosphere and out of the ground and turning it into something that is beneficial for society instead of something that damages society.
A lot of what you've been talking about sounds very similar to a lot of indigenous cultures and how they lived and how they governed themselves. Is that similar to what you've been talking about? And do you think that that would work? Thinking about 7 generations out and what's best for all, including
yes,
the Earth?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Indigenous thinking around the world was inherently sustainable pre-colonization. Otherwise, it wouldn't have survived. And you're absolutely right. There's many governance mechanisms that exist within Indigenous wisdom that we can benefit from and adapt to. In fact, many of these systems I'm talking about were created because exactly of such a thing. The donut economy model comes out of the UK, but it's being trialed in Amsterdam as the first city that's applying this economic model, which is all about that thinking. How does what you do flow back on itself in recirculating bases that have a net positive impact on every single euro you spend? What happened in New Zealand was the New Zealand Maori took the donut economy model and they made a Maori donut economy model, which was all about indigenous wisdom in their space from their perspective. And they took that back to the gut person, the woman who created the donut economy, and she just loved it and embraced it and swallowed it into her system. That's an example of a feedback loop, which is constantly going. And there's a lot of indigenous wisdom that could be learned from, but the indigenous people of the world have also been affected and influenced by all of these processes we're talking about. So there is no, you've got all the answers anywhere, because every community has been, in fact, polluted by neoliberal capitalist destructive thinking. So, yes, and is what I like to say.
It's interesting because I'm in the Northeast, and the Haudenosaunee, the way that they govern themselves, we in the United States based a lot of how we govern through what their laws were. And so what type of government then, you were saying that democracy maybe isn't the best way to govern ourselves right now to make these changes. What would you suggest? What type of government? Because in doing some research before, there was Plato and everybody else was saying, you go through these successions of different types of governments and how, we go through autocracy, the whole gambit. And then you get to democracy, and then does it start all over again, or is it something different this time?
Well, it's interesting. That's a very good question. There are various versions of democracy in the world as well. Having been fortunate to have lived in Switzerland, they have the most advanced democracy on the planet, where all Swiss citizens get to vote via referendum every 3 months on issues, and they make decisions constantly on everything from, should we change this law to that law, or should we create some brand new thing, or should we repeal something? So there's this deep process in Switzerland of everybody living in Switzerland being really educated and understanding it is their duty to be informed about the issues and to take part in the process. So what you have there is an advanced form of democracy, which is constantly evolving. And Switzerland's also quite unique because the way it works is based on a degree of proportional representation, which all advanced democracies have to go to be truly representative of anything. What they do in Switzerland is you could have the finance minister from a far right party and the minister of health being from a far left party, and they form a government together. It's not one party runs the government. It's the parties get the proportional breakdown in how things are run. So if 1% of the voters vote for communists, they get 1% of the decision-making in government. Not you get nothing because you didn't win. And so you always have this inherent process where people of very different viewpoints are working together with each other to find a way. Now, there are challenges with that too. If you're a minority in Switzerland, it's very hard to get anything done because you just don't have enough votes, right? And it was one of the last countries in the West to get for women to get the right to vote. Very, very late. Like we're talking late 70s, early 80s. Really
wow,
late.
I didn't realize that.
And that was because the Swiss women were not calling for it in enough number for it to be the case, which is funny because young Swiss women would have been very angry about that. But older Swiss women were like, look, I run the show anyway. I tell my husband what to vote for. So I don't need to. And that's really what happened. You had that division.
Right. Yeah.
So, you know, PR, proportional representation, is an absolute integral part of any modern advanced democracy because it's the only way to take into account the broadness of perspective other than A or B or C. The other thing is that democracy seems to be one of the few political management systems which gives rise to fascism. Fascism doesn't come out of dictatorships or autocracies very often. It usually comes out of democracy. So that actually shows you in the life cycle of democracy that a lot of democracies go that way and go to fascism. And we've seen lots of examples of this all over the world in the last few years. Lots of examples. It's interesting because what does that mean? What is the best system? I don't think there is the best system. Each system has its strength and its weakness. For instance, the dictatorship of China, and it's not communism. China is no way communism. People misunderstand that. It's not even socialist anymore. It's a dictatorship. And China's system is incredibly good to get things done. Like if they decide as a government, we are now going to do X, right? We're going to now put high-speed rail throughout the whole country. 5 years, you're done. It's not done. Like everywhere else in the West, which is 25, 30.
Yeah.
So they can actually do more quickly. But there is a cost, which is freedom is an idea. That's all it is. And probably the most advanced examples of sustainable economies are going to be the Scandinavians, which all have advanced forms of democracy with proportional representation. Proportional representation is present in almost every democracy in the world. The US, Canada, and the United Kingdom are some of the few that don't have it. Almost everybody else does. So it's a rare thing to not have PR. Very rare. It just happens to be that many of us are living in countries that don't have it. And I've lived in 8 countries and 5 of them had PR. And it was quite clear how easy the systems were, and they had different approaches to it.
Interesting.
So it's a hard question because, as a student of political science, what I can say is it's not that there's a system per se that is going to be the one that you have to follow, but rather changing the system so it incorporates the external variables and removes the cult of personality, because cult of personality is incredibly dangerous because it's going to lead to whatever that personality is. And it just as easily could be that they're completely against survival of the species as they are for it. and that's a high risk. So we need systems that ultimately protect humanity from itself.
Exactly, exactly. So to bring it down more to the individual level, if someone wanted to start a small community and take this on a microscopic level, how would they begin? Where do you start? What do you do?
Well, the best thing to do is to learn from others who have already done it. There's a vast amount of information out there about eco-villages all over the world, co-housing models, sustainable communities that have been set up across the planet that have succeeded and failed. Some have done really well, others haven't. I mean, for instance, the West Coast of the United States has got quite a few co-housing and eco-villages in it. The countries with the best examples of abundance of these are the UK, the Netherlands, France, New Zealand, Australia. There's brilliant examples. And it's basically, you could even take, for instance, a place in Scotland called Findhorn that teaches people how to build their own sustainable communities over a 10-day long intensive course that you actually are advised to bring your entire family to. Because it's like, here's processes, methodologies, technologies, finances, governance. Like there's a lot to learn about it, but there's quite a few examples. So, and now we've got a lot more examples from the permaculture world of permaculture land management systems, regenerative agricultural models. And what else I think is really important is if people are really interested in this, look at the stuff that's on the edge, that 1, 2, 3, 5% extreme version of it, but also look for mainstream companies or people that have tried to shift towards it in some degree. Like a mainstream farmer in the Midwest US switching to regenerative agriculture, and they got 500 head of cattle, and they actually have done it. And they're like, wow, this has saved me so much money. My cows are healthier, and I'm not being affected by the droughts that are coming more often than everybody else because my fields are way healthier because I'm not doing what everybody else does. I'm letting perennial grasses do their job instead of me killing and replacing.
Which is right. Yeah.
And a good example of that is we call that conventional agriculture, and we call organic agriculture alternative. Organic agriculture has been practiced for 99.999% of human existence. That's not alternative. That's conventional. Modern agriculture is alternative. It's just something that we don't often recognize. Pouring poisons on the land and fertilizers on the land is only something that's happened in the last 70 to 80 years. So it's a tiny blip of human existence, and it has helped us get a lot more food out of the land. But it's cost the land by destroying the structure of the soil, which is untenable. You can't keep doing that.
Right. Yeah. So what new energy sources do you think are on the horizon, and can we shift over in a broad sense to these new sources? Because it seems like, at least in the US, we're going towards more electric vehicles. But then, where do you get the electricity? Is it all just solar panels? Is it wind energy?
It's always going to be a mix, because when it comes to electricity, the way to manage an electrical system is you have to be able to manage your outputs at all times. So you can have a degree of intermittence, which is power sources that vary what they produce. Solar obviously varies based on daylight, nighttime, and based on the weather. The wind varies based on the weather. So you cannot replace a conventional grid entirely with intermittent sources of power, because there's going to be impossible to carry the base load at certain times. So you always have to have a mix of different technologies. Most grids can handle about 40% intermittence. That means 40% wind and solar, for instance. Some grids can handle more, some can handle less. Depends on how they're designed and what their demands are. But solar is already crushing it. Wind is now the cheapest form of electricity generation on the planet, and the second cheapest is solar. Now, wind has dropped by 70-odd% in the last 6 years. Solar's dropped by around the same in the last 5. And that trend for wind is going to continue, but not at the same steep angle. Solar is probably going to drop by another 45% in the next 5 to 10 years. So that solar is going to push past or get close to wind for price point. And once you have these things starting to happen, then you can start incorporating energy storage. So this is batteries, this is compressed air, this is a whole variety of different ways of storing electricity. So you can imagine building big solar farms and wind farms in the same location, because wind's energy profile is the opposite of solar. Lowest outputs during the day when it's hot, highest outputs at night when it's windy. So they work really well together. And then you could have energy storage on site, so that feeds the grid something at all times. Then you start to incorporate some base load of energy. And there is a significant amount of power possible from renewable natural gas, which is natural gas that's made from organic waste. Humans produce vast amounts of it in our food waste streams, in our sewage streams. So do animals. So do a lot of industries with fiber and wood.
Right. Yeah.
There's a vast amount of energy that can be created on an ongoing basis out of that. And this is where the hydrogen economy starts to come in, because you can make hydrogen out of that as well. So you then end up with this interesting systems integration. There are other power sources that are needed, like a lot of places still want nuclear, because nuclear is great for baseload. It's very, very, very expensive. Nuclear power is the most expensive way of generating electricity, but it's lower carbon. It's not zero carbon. It's lower carbon because the amount of energy you have to invest into getting the fuel for nuclear reactors and constructing and decommissioning and storing waste is gigantic. So, we're shifting away from fossils, basically. We're moving away from oil and coal and eventually natural gas, conventional natural gas and LNG, because the simple fact is they have too high a cost, and the cost is to the environment. So the technologies are going to continue to evolve and improve. There is a possibility we may actually get commercialized fusion power as well. There's a number of companies around the world that are working really hard on this, and that is a potential as well. There are also different forms of nuclear power, thorium power, which is how nuclear was originally designed, but it was shifted to conventional nuclear because they wanted nuclear waste that they could use for the nuclear weapon industry. So thorium doesn't produce nuclear waste the same way. So there's a lot of different techs that can come together to do this, but some examples are really great. The UK has shifted to about 48% renewable power over 10 years. That's huge. California has done some big shifts.
Right.
And there's countries around the world that have done a really good job of this. Hydropower is another place where you've got the right geography and the right water flows. Hydro can make a huge difference, but it's also high impact. When you build a new hydro dam, you do vast amounts of damage to the environment.
Yeah.
So, it's really about trying to find the right balance. But there is an impact to everything humans do. Electricity is where everything's going. We're going to shift to a fully electric economies over the next 20 to 30 years, where everything is electrically powered. Your heating, your transportation, your industry. That is where it's coming, because we can decarbonize electricity.
Well, yeah, until we get a nice solar flare and it knocks it out. But
yeah.
We have to think more, broader, as you said, with everything that's happening nowadays. But it's interesting because where I live, I could walk to the next solar farm. There's several in my area, and if I look up in the hills, I can see the wind farm. So,
so they're right around
how things have changed. Yeah,
exactly. And things have changed radically. And there are people who are worried about the impact of wind and solar on the environment. One of the most important things to measure there is that it takes a wind turbine an average of 6 to 12 months to pay back its embodied energy in itself with the extra energy it generates. Solar takes about 2 years. So even with all the impacts of manufacturing solar panels and wind turbines and taking them through their lifespan, and at the end of their life recycling them, they make up 10 to 25 times the energy that went into them in extra production. That's why they're beneficial.
So what do you see? You were alluding to this earlier in the show, but what do you see as the panacea, if there is one, of what we could do other than changing human behavior?
Yes.
Where are we headed with all of this, Jay?
Anybody who works in the sustainability field has to be inherently, even though it may be very buried deep down, an optimist. Otherwise, you wouldn't do this work. You don't go into sustainability because it's an easy career or it makes you lots of money. You go into it because you're mission driven. Just like a lot of people who work in the NGO sector or the third sector, they're in it because they care about a vision of whatever it may be. What I would say is, I've been asked this question many times. Am I an optimist or a pessimist about our future? I'm optimistic about the fact that we have everything we need to solve this already. I'm pessimistic about the fact that humans are not evidence-based decision makers. And our people who work in the science field or the sustainability field or the engineering world, they tend to use data to try and communicate why things should be this way or that way. When in fact, the vast majority of decisions that humans make are emotional.
Yeah, right,
And
right.
that's a disjunction.
Yeah, you got to feel it in the heart. Yeah.
You do, but also let's break down the reality of what it is to be a human being. The things that matter to us deeply are the things we love, the things we care about, the things we feel. None of that is logical, and none of that is evidence-based. So because we're not evidence-based decision makers, we keep walking around with the hypothesis that more evidence will help people make better decisions. The evidence doesn't support that hypothesis. No. It's showing us right now, humans are not good at taking in information that contravenes how they feel. That's why we have cognitive dissonance. So I find this a really amazingly, in many ways, hilarious situation where the most advanced creature on the planet Earth seems to be missing one piece of the puzzle in order to protect itself from itself. And I don't know, what are our chances of avoiding collapse? I think they're pretty small. I think it's pretty well going to happen. Could they be different? Absolutely. Do we have what we need? Absolutely. Is it clearly easy to communicate it? Yes. Is it easy to educate them? Yes. But, after 25 years in sustainability, my whole career has amounted to learning lots and lots and lots about knowing how to solve the problems that keep getting worse. So I don't know, but going back to that deeper thing, which is maybe that's just the cycle we're on.
Right. Well, yeah. And it's interesting because a lot of my work before I started doing all this was heart-centered, literally, and researching the metaphysical and the physical heart. And I really truly believe that it's only through the heart that we can awaken and make it through this time. And so each one of us, we do have a role to play. So, and that's how the indigenous lived, was through the heart. And, instead of giving the mental facts and the logical and the left brain stuff, take time to go into the right brain and feel what feels right and feel what it might be like for your children and their children and what it might be like for the animals and the plants, and make your decisions from that.
And for me, it also comes down to things like, each of us sitting here now listening to this come from thousands of generations of our ancestors who worked really hard to get us here. Really, really hard to make it possible for us to be sitting here now. And we are in the privileged position and the powerful and very weighty position to be at this precipice of our species, where our children and our children's children and our children's children are going to have a lot harder time with a lot less options, with a lot less happiness, if we don't do something ourselves quite severely different than what we've done before. Now, I try to stand at that precipice looking backwards and looking forwards. And I feel this never-ending clarity about the need to try and steer us in a direction that doesn't lead to those negative outputs for the future. Because I'm honoring the past and I'm honoring the future. And you're right, the left brain is in the dark. The right brain is where our artistic and curiosity and exploratory creation comes from. And we now are clearly at a precipice seeing that what we are doing don't work. Therefore, we need something different. And the best place for something different comes from creativity and artistic creation.
Yes.
Right? And as Einstein said, at the very top of physics, you enter the realm of philosophy and art, and it circles around again, says one of the best scientists in history.
Oh, yeah.
Right. And
Yes.
and I think that's fascinating. Is when people start to actually find the synergy of art and science into something that is, it's hard to differentiate where the boundaries are.
Exactly. Well, I think that's a great place to close. And I'm so appreciative of this conversation. It was a great conversation, Jae, and I hope everybody takes it to heart where we are right now and what you can do to make your change, because you're each a pebble in the ocean and we create waves and we're all connected, just like the waves. Thank you so much, Jae, for being here today. I so appreciate it.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk. Really appreciate that.
Take care.